Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us, and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story. The southern town of Elmwood, surrounded by endless cotton fields and old oaks, seemed like a place where time stood still. Almost everything here was a reminder of the past, the deteriorating facades of the houses, the signs that had once shone brightly but were now peeling, and the quiet streets that were rarely animated by loud voices. But behind this apparent silence lurked a troubling history. Elmwood was a place where the memory of the slave past lived in every corner. A monument to Confederate heroes stood in the center of town, and a local school was named after a general who fought to preserve slavery. Even decades after the abolition of segregation, the division between whites and blacks was still felt here, in schools, churches, stores, and in the hearts of the people. The black community lived on the outskirts of the city, where houses looked like they were on the verge of destruction. In one of these houses lived Michael, a 10-year-old boy with vivid dreams. His father worked in construction, and his mother cleaned the homes of wealthy white families. Despite the harsh conditions, they tried to give their son the best they could. In the center of town, on the Old Kings Road, stood an abandoned shop. The roof was half gone, the paint on the walls was peeling, and the doors were boarded up. Whenever black children passed by, they tried not to look at the shop, as if they were afraid it held some sinister power. This shop had once belonged to Henry Wilkes, an elderly white man of notoriety. Henry was a man who could not accept change. His shop closed when the big supermarkets displaced the small traders, but he blamed it on the new generation, especially the blacks. To him, they were the cause of all the trouble. Henry lived in a ramshackle house nearby, coming to his shop every day as if he were guarding it from non-existent enemies. Elmwood was a place where memories of the past still poisoned the future. People lived in this constant tension, trying to cope with life without contributing anything new to it. But no one knew that one day little Michael, with his pencils and dreams, would change the history of this place. Michael Williams was an ordinary boy from an extraordinary family. In his 10 years, he possessed an inner light that could warm even the coldest heart. He liked to dream of the future, though life often showed him that dreams in Elmwood were a luxury. He was thin, with big brown eyes that sparkled when he drew something. Michael could sit at the kitchen table for hours, concentrating on an old notebook with a pencil. His mother, Mary, liked to watch him, sometimes standing behind him while she peeled potatoes or did laundry in a small basin. "You paint like a real artist, Mikey," she said proudly, looking at his drawings. "One day, the whole world will see what you can do." Michael only smiled embarrassedly. He knew his mother's words were a comfort, but he wanted to believe they were true. Michael's father, James, was a stern man, used to hard work. Every morning, he left before dawn and returned late at night with dusty hands and a haggard look on his face. James rarely spoke, but when he saw his son's drawings, his face softened. "You're doing good, son. Don't give up," he said one evening after dinner. Michael loved to draw everything he saw around him: their old house with peeling paint, the dusty roads where old trucks drove, and even the people in their neighborhood, tired but proud. But most of all, he wanted to paint something that would leave a mark on the world. His passion for drawing began when his mother brought him a half-empty box of colored pencils from a house she was cleaning. It was his first real art tool. Michael cherished them like a treasure, sharpening them diligently and never breaking them. Despite their poverty, the Williams family was close-knit. They often spent evenings talking or reading the Bible. Mary always tried to instill in her children a sense of pride in themselves, even when the world around them reminded them of their low status. Michael was not only a talented artist, but also a boy with a big heart. He was always helping neighbors, whether it was the elderly Miss Johnson with her heavy bags or Mr. Harris, whose old chickens often escaped from the yard. However, Michael had one thing in common: he could not keep quiet when he saw injustice. At school, he often stood up for other children if they were teased. This sometimes got him into trouble, because white teachers did not like it when someone too smart from their community spoke out. But despite this, Michael continued to believe in the best. His dream was to become an artist whose paintings could inspire people. He imagined that one day his works would hang in galleries in big cities, and people of all colors would look at them and feel that they were not alone. Michael's dreams were huge for a boy from such a small town, but his eyes shone with the certainty that even in this world full of injustice, there was room for hope. One day he told his mother, "Mom, I want to paint what others can't see. I want people to realize that the world can be changed." Mary smiled, hugging him tightly. She knew her son was special, and she was afraid for him. After all, Elmwood was a place where dreams too often collided with a reality full of hate. Soon Michael began looking for new inspiration for his drawings. This inspiration led him to an abandoned shop on King's Road, where the story that changed his life forever began. On King's Road, one of the oldest streets in Elmwood, stood a building that seemed to embody the spirit of the age itself, gloomy and dilapidated, as if it carried the weight of all the old prejudices of the town. Henry Wilkes' abandoned store was more than just a crumbling structure. It was a symbol of the hatred and division that permeated Elmwood. Once upon a time, many years ago, it was a thriving store that sold everything from flour to tools. Henry, being the owner, kept it strictly for his own people. Blacks could only look through the window and keep quiet. He wouldn't let them in, even if they had money. "There's nothing here for you," he was fond of repeating if anyone dared to come closer. When the big chain stores came to town, Henry's store began to die. Locals began to prefer the convenience and low prices of the big stores. For Henry, it was a blow. He didn't blame the economy, but those he had spent his life thinking of as lower class. After the shop closed, Henry became even angrier and more withdrawn. Every day he would go to his old store, sit on the porch, drink strong tea from a metal mug, and stare at passers-by. His gaze was especially hard when black people walked by. The place became intimidating to all the children of the neighborhood. Even white children avoided it, knowing that old man Henry did not tolerate noise or play near his shrine. One day, walking home from school, Michael noticed the store. It looked especially strange in the light of the setting sun. The boards on the windows were shabby. The sign, "Wilkes General Store," was half erased by time, and the lock on the door was rusty. Michael paused, looking at the building. His attention was caught by an old sign above the door, "Welcome All," written in large faded letters. The irony of the sign made him think. "Welcome, to whom?" Michael muttered under his breath. The next day he came here with a notebook and pencils. He wanted to draw the shop, but not as it was. He decided to make it come alive, full of people of different colors, to show what it could become. Michael settled down on the sidewalk across the street and began to draw. The pencil moved deftly across the paper. He concentrated on adding details: the sunlight, the reflections on the windows, the open doors through which happy customers exited. He was so caught up in the inspiration that he didn't notice Henry's old truck coming around the corner. The truck stopped abruptly, brakes squealing, and Henry himself stepped out of the cab, holding an old wooden cane. "What are you doing here, kid?" he shouted when he saw Michael. Michael flinched, but he wasn't frightened. He raised his hat and said politely, "Drawing?" "Sure." Henry squinted, glancing at Michael's sketchbook. His eyes narrowed when he noticed the happy people in the drawing, which obviously didn't look like what he was used to seeing in his store. "Get out of here," Henry said loudly. You have no right to sit here and draw some nonsense. Michael clutched the notebook, but didn't move from his seat. It's just a drawing, Jer. I'm not bothering anyone. Henry stepped closer, his face red with anger. He grabbed the notebook out of Michael's hands, flipped through the pages quickly, and then tore it in half. Don't you dare come here again. Do you hear me? He hissed. Michael watched in silence as the sheets of his work fell to the ground. Anger and pain boiled inside him, but he knew it was pointless to argue with Henry. He quietly picked up his pencils and scraps of paper, turned and walked away. This day was Michael's first encounter with the cruel injustice that had settled in the hearts of some people. He felt he had to do something, but he didn't know what it was yet. Henry Wilkes lived in a house that looked like a museum of the past. Faded portraits of his ancestors hung on the walls, and the cupboard was filled with china cups that no one had used in decades. Everything around him reminded him of a time when the world was right in Henry's eyes. His life had revolved around the shop until it closed. Now he woke up every day with the sole purpose of guarding it, as if it was his last link to the world. Henry had always felt victimized. His anger at the modern world boiled up inside him like a lingering storm. When he passed the black residence of Elmwood, his gaze was heavy and judgmental. It seemed to him that everything bad that had happened to him was their fault. They've taken over everything, he muttered to himself, sitting in his old chair by the window. There's no work, the shop is closed, and it's all because of these changes. His words were poisoned with the poison of prejudice that fed on fear and bitterness. But it wasn't just anger, it was fear of losing his place in the world. Henry couldn't bear the thought that times had changed. When he saw Michael outside his shop, his anger flared up instantly. To Henry, this boy was the embodiment of everything he hated. Young, full of hope, with a notebook that spoke of the future instead of the past. It reminded Henry of what he himself had long ago lost, dreams and the will to live. These kids have no respect for anything, he muttered to himself as he approached Michael. But there was more than anger behind his rudeness. Every time Henry saw someone like Michael, he remembered moments from his youth. He remembered how his father, as a shopkeeper, had taught him that there were people of our circle and there were everyone else. Michael, on the other hand, was the complete opposite of Henry. Even after the old man tore up his drawing, the boy didn't back down. He picked up the remains of his work and looked at Henry with an expression that made the old man feel uncomfortable. It wasn't fear, but something else, a mixture of disappointment and pity. Why did you do it? Michael asked quietly, looking straight into Henry's eyes. That question caught the old man off guard. No one had ever asked him such a question. Everyone was either afraid of him or simply avoided him. Get out of here before I call the police, he replied sharply, averting his gaze. Michael silently turned and walked away. But even after the boy was out of sight, Henry couldn't calm down. His heart pounded louder than usual. For some reason, that look in Michael's eyes haunted him. That night Henry did not sleep. He lay on his old bed, staring at the ceiling. He remembered Michael's face, his quiet but firm voice, his question, "Why did you do it?" Henry tried to justify himself. "This is my place. I won't let them take what's mine," he whispered to himself. But even those words brought him no comfort. Meanwhile, Michael returned home and didn't tell his mother what had happened. He knew she would be worried, and he didn't want to alarm her. Instead, he sat her down at the table and began to draw a new picture. This time it wasn't a bench, but a portrait of Henry himself, surrounded by dark shadows, but with a small glimmer of light in the corner. Michael couldn't understand why the old man was so angry, but he felt that there was something in his heart that couldn't be seen at a glance. Henry, sitting at the window, returned again and again to the boy, with his notebook and his burning eyes. He was angry at himself for having been so affected by that moment. "It's just a boy," he told himself, but deep down, Henry realized that this boy was more than just a boy. He was a reflection of what Henry had always feared, the change that couldn't be stopped. The next day, Michael headed toward the abandoned shop again. Despite yesterday's incident, he felt he had to go back. For some reason, this old store attracted him like a magnet. He couldn't forget the look on Henry's face, a mixture of rage, bitterness, and something else he couldn't understand. This time Michael brought not only his notebook, but also the colored pencils his mother had given him. He knew he risked running into Henry again, but something inside told him he shouldn't be afraid. He sat down in the same spot as yesterday, Saturday, down on the sidewalk, and began to draw. This time he decided to paint Henry, but not as he was known, angry and sullen. Michael painted the old man as he might have been if he had let go of his anger, with a soft smile on his face, standing at the door of the shop, which was once again a place for everyone. It was about an hour later when Michael heard the familiar sound of squealing brakes. He felt his palms go cold, but he didn't look up. Henry's truck had stopped right in front of him. "I told you not to come here again," came Henry's loud voice. Michael silently continued to draw, though his hands were shaking slightly. "Are you deaf or something?" Henry stepped closer, his cane thudding loudly on the pavement. "What are you messing up again?" Michael raised his head and calmly replied, "I'm drawing you, Jer." Those words made Henry freeze for a moment. No one had ever said anything like that to him before. He stepped closer and snatched the notebook out of Michael's hands, as if it were a burning torch. The old man looked at the drawing, and his face twisted with anger. He saw his own image on the paper, soft and kind, as he had not seen himself for a long time. This portrait, made by a child's hand, seemed to expose his weaknesses to him. What the hell is this?" he shouted, crumpling the drawing and throwing it to the ground. "You think you know me, boy? You think I'm like this?" "I think you might be," Michael said quietly, but there was confidence in his voice. Henry picked up the notebook and angrily began tearing the pages off one by one. The paper flew to the ground, scattered by the wind. "You don't know anything," he shouted, tearing up the drawings Michael had spent hours of his time on. "You'll never understand what it means to lose everything." Michael watched in silence as his work turned to shreds. His heart ached, but he didn't let himself cry. He could see that Henry wasn't just angry, he was hurting. "I haven't lost anything, Jer," Michael said, his voice flat but bitter. "But you just took from me what was mine." Those words hit Henry harder than he expected. He stopped, holding the last page of the notebook, and looked at the boy. Michael met his gaze squarely, not averting his eyes. "Get out of here before I do something worse," Henry muttered, lowering his head. Michael gathered up the rest of his notebook, stood up slowly, and headed away. He had a feeling he'd left something important behind, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. When Michael got home, he put the torn pages on the table and looked at them. Some of the drawings were irretrievably ruined, but a few sheets had been saved. He said quietly to himself, "They can tear paper, but they can't break my dreams." That evening, he began a new drawing. This time it was Henry, surrounded not by light but by darkness. But there was still a tiny flicker of hope in the corner of the darkness. Meanwhile, Henry was sitting in his house, holding the very piece of paper he had accidentally torn. It was a sketch of his shop as it might become. Henry stared at it for a long time, until old memories began to come back to him. But that night was only the beginning. Nothing in Elmwood could ever be the same again. Elmwood lived by its own laws, and one of them was an unwritten but strict one: don't interface. People here were used to turning away, closing doors and windows if something unpleasant happened. Everyone knew his place, and going outside, it always meant trouble. As Henry tore up Michael's drawings right in the middle of the street, There were people walking down King's Road, white men with briefcases hurrying downtown, women returning from the market, and even teenagers on bicycles. None of them stopped. Some of them gave brief glances, but immediately looked away, quickening their steps. Michael could feel their glances, as if to say, "It's none of my business." Mrs. Hudson, an elderly woman walking with a basket of vegetables, stopped for a moment, as if about to say something, but then, seeing Henry's face, she frowned and went on, muttering something under her breath. "The old man is just protecting his own," she muttered, as if justifying what was happening. Little Jimmy, a boy of about 12, riding past on his bicycle, paused, but his father, following, shouted sharply, "Don't delay, Jim, it's none of your business." "But he's just drawing," the boy started, but his father grabbed him by the handlebars and pushed him forward. "We're not here to interface," he added sternly. Michael, kneeling and picking up the scraps of his drawings, felt that silence. It was deafening. It was the silence of people who saw injustice but prefer to ignore it. "Why doesn't anyone do anything?" he thought, looking at another passerby who had crossed to the other side of the street to avoid the scene. He knew the answer. These men were afraid of Henry and what he represented. To them, his shop was more than just an old building. It was a symbol of an old order they either supported or feared to destroy. The white townspeople did not want to interface, lest they incur Henry's wrath, and the blacks who sometimes walked down the street lowered their eyes and hurried away, knowing that any word could cause further humiliation. Malcolm Hayes, a local shoemaker, watched from afar. He was one of the few blacks who sometimes allowed himself to openly watch such scenes, but even he didn't intervene. Malcolm sighed and, with his hands in his pockets, walked on. "The boy should realize where he lives," he said quietly to himself. When Michael finally gathered up the scraps, there was no one lingering in the street. The passers-by had dispersed, each taking their share of silent indifference, leaving the boy alone. He got up and slowly walked home, feeling heavy not only from the humiliation, but also from the realization that no one had even tried to help him. "Everyone has seen it, no one said anything," he thought, clutching the torn pages. The thought stung him more than Henry's words. The indifference was worse than open malice. Meanwhile, Henry had returned to his truck. He noticed the way people shunned him, but to him it was a familiar thing. He found a strange kind of power in his solitude. "People know I'm right," he thought, blowing smoke from an old cigar. "That's why they don't say anything." But deep inside, behind the heavy curtain of anger, Henry felt something strange. It was not victory. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was some strength in this boy and his stubbornness that he couldn't break despite his attempts. Elmwood continued to live its usual life. The streets were filled with the noise of cars, the laughter of children, and the shouts of street vendors, but somewhere on the sidewalk, shreds of Michael's torn drawings still lay rustling under the feet of indifferent passers-by. Michael knew this was not the end. His silence was only temporary. He decided that he would no longer watch injustice go unnoticed. Michael returned home as the sun was already slipping toward dusk. His footsteps were slow and heavy, and he was holding the remains of a torn notebook. He felt his insides clench with pain, his chest tearing at something important and warm that he was trying to protect. All the way home he walked, almost unaware of what was going on around him. His mind was spinning with thoughts of Henry, of the silence of the passers-by, of the endless silent approval of injustice. He didn't know what to do next. All these attempts to paint the world he wanted to see seemed futile. When Michael opened the door to the house, his mother was sitting in the kitchen preparing dinner. She paid no attention to his condition, as she always did. He was her son, and she knew when he was hiding something. She saw, too, how he was breathing heavily, how his face hid despair. "You're home?" she said calmly. but with that intuitive softness that only mothers had. "Is everything all right, darling?" Michael was silent, setting the notebook on the table. He didn't know where to begin. Everything he had experienced seemed too loud for his mother. She had always been quiet and wise, and there was an understanding in her eyes that he had never fully realized. She rose from her seat and walked over to him. Her hands were warm and caring, as always. "Don't tell me what's wrong. I can tell from you that something's wrong," she said softly, hugging her son. "Do you want to talk about it?" Michael sighed heavily and sat down in his chair. His eyes dimmed with disappointment, but his mother, as always, knew how to be there for him. She didn't rush him, didn't ask him to tell him right away, but her silence was like a support, ready to take his pain. It's Henry. He tore up my drawings, said I didn't understand anything, that I shouldn't be here," Michael said quietly, clutching the scraps of sketchbook with his hands. His mother took his hands and said calmly, "You know, Michael, people are often afraid of what they don't understand. They don't see what you have to give to the world. But that doesn't mean you're not important." Michael looked at her, his eyes full of questions. She continued, "Henry may hate you because he is afraid of change. He's afraid that you, like all the other kids, might come along and destroy his world, destroy what he's always thought was right. But you don't have to let his fears define your path. You are stronger than you think." Michael felt her words, like warm hands on his shoulders, pulling him gradually out of the abyss of despair. He remembered how his mother had always encouraged him when all seemed lost. She never told him the world would be easy, but she always taught him to be strong in his truth. "I understand," Michael said, feeling his faith returning inside. "But he hates me so much. Why?" His mother sat down beside him and gently ran her palm through his hair. "People sometimes don't realize how others may feel. Henry has grown so much that he's forgotten what it's like to be free. He's stuck in his old thoughts, and maybe he can't believe that you, so young, already know more than he once could have imagined. It's not your fault, Michael. You don't have to understand everything that goes on in his head." Michael listened to her in silence, and then he looked up, his eyes full of determination. He felt his heart fill with light again, as if his mother were the source of the light he himself could not find in this cruel world. "Thank you, Mom. I'll keep painting. I won't let it break me," he said, and there was a hardness in his voice that he hadn't realized before. His mother smiled softly and put her arm around him. "I know you can do it, Michael. You're strong, you're smart, and your dreams are important. Don't let other people's fears stand in your way. Someday they will look at you and wonder how you were able to become who you are. And you are already, as I see it, becoming a person who will change the world." Michael felt his chest fill with warmth. She always knew how to give him back his confidence. He picked up the notebook, set it in front of him, and started drawing again. This time his drawing was not only a reflection of what he saw in the world around him, but also of what he felt inside. He drew for himself and only for himself, not thinking about what others would say. When he was done, the sheet had a vivid scene. Michael stood in the street, surrounded by light, looking at Henry's ruined shop. There were silhouettes of people all around him, but they were all blurred, like shadows. He stood firm, staring forward, his face shining with determination. "This will be my future," Michael whispered, his eyes full of hope. The mother, looking into the notebook, said quietly, "This will be your story, son, and it will be an important one." Night came to Elmwood quietly, as it always did, casting a soft shadow over the town. Michael's house was quiet. The light from the kitchen window, where his mother cooked, streamed out, illuminating the empty street. Everything around him was engulfed in the night's tranquility. But inside Michael's mind, emotions raged. His thoughts were unrelenting. He Saturday at his old desk, surrounded by scraps of paper, pencils and coloring books. From time to time, he leaned back in his chair and looked out the window, through which he could see the starry night. There was the same silence in his heart as there was in this house, but it wasn't filled with peace, but with an abiding feeling that he needed to change something. Michael pulled out one of the remaining whole sheets, wiped the dust off his pencils, and slowly began to draw. His hand moved confidently, but there was something in its movements that Michael couldn't explain. It wasn't just an image, it was a cry of the soul. He wasn't just drawing a picture, but a reflection of everything he felt. His thoughts and feelings were intertwined. He thought of Henry, of how he seemed stuck in his past, surrounded by the evil he had created. He thought about the silent bystanders who didn't intervene, didn't try to change the situation, about how it was easier for them to pass by than to say a single word in defense. But especially he thought about his future, about the world he might be able to create if he continued to believe in himself and his dreams. He saw himself in the future, but not as a boy who was afraid to show his work. He saw an artist standing in front of a gallery full of people and looking proudly at his paintings. This was his path, but he had to go through a lot to get there. His hand moved across the paper, and the outline of a new work began to appear on the sheet. It was a portrait of old Henry, not as he was now, but as he might have been. There was much light, warmth in the image, but there was still a light of unresolved fear in Henry's eyes. But in this portrait, he wasn't evil. He was a man who might have chosen a different path if only he had seen it. Michael could feel his inspiration growing with every stroke, with every movement of his hand. But this wasn't just painting. This was liberation. He could do this. He could create a world where people would look at others not with suspicion and hatred, but with understanding and kindness. But there were also doubts. Michael often asked himself questions. What if it doesn't work out? What if people don't see what I put into my work? What if the world stays the same? These thoughts puzzled him, and he stopped again and again to look at the painting, wondering if he had sufficiently expressed his truth in it. He looked at Henry again in his drawing. That look was different. It wasn't angry or proud. It was the look of a man who might not understand everything that was going on around him. But in that look, there was a spark of something that could change him. Michael smiled to himself, feeling something change inside. He realized that not everything had to be clear from the beginning. Sometimes it's enough to take the first step and the rest will come. He kept working until he finished his painting. This was his first real step towards his future. It was his cry, I'm here, and I'm going to fight for my place in this world. When he was done, Michael pushed back his chair and stepped away from the table to look at his work. He was tired, but at the same time, he glowed with an inner light. The drawing wasn't just a painting, it was the beginning of something more, and he knew it. He turned off the light in the room and went to the window. The night was still quiet, and the stars shone above him. But Michael no longer felt lonely. There was something new in his heart, hope. I'm not alone, he whispered, looking up into the dark sky. And if I follow my own path, I can change the world. With those words, Michael went to bed knowing that tomorrow would start a new day, a new step on the path he had chosen for himself. The next morning Michael got up early, determined. He Saturday at his desk and stared at the completed drawing that now hung on the wall of his room. It was not just a picture of Henry, but a symbol of something much more significant. Michael's hand wasn't just drawing, it was sending a message that love could conquer hate, that even in the darkest corners of the world, there was room for light. Michael decided that he would not hide his work. It was too important to go unnoticed. He made a decision that had previously seemed impossible. He would write words on the painting that could be heard by everyone. He carefully wrote in large letters directly below the image. The message was like an explosion in his soul. Michael felt it fill his heart with determination and faith. For him, It was not just a slogan, but a way of telling everyone that they could change their lives, change society. He believed that in this world full of fear and hostility, there was room for those who would fight for love and understanding. When Michael came into town, with the painting in hand, he noticed that the people of Elmwood were still just as busy with their daily lives, but this time his gaze was not the same as before. He wasn't depressed by their indifference. He felt that his message was important. He could see that somewhere, in the very depths, it was beginning to move something. He headed toward the central square where people usually gathered. There were benches, and people were discussing the news of the day. He approached one of them and, gathering his courage, placed his painting on the ground. He immediately attracted attention. People started coming up, one by one, stopping to look at the painting. The first to approach was James, a young guy with dirty hands from working on the construction site, who was always walking around with a scowl on his face. He took a closer look at the painting and frowned a little. Michael felt his heart beat faster. "Hey, are you out of your mind?" James asked. "Is this yours? What are you going to do with it?" Michael was ready for ridicule, but his gaze remained steadfast. "I want people to see it," he replied, looking straight into James's eyes. "It's a message. Love is stronger than hate. We all need to remember that." James was silent, scrutinizing the painting. Michael saw something change in his gaze. After a few seconds, James smiled slightly and nodded. "Well, that makes sense," he said, and a few other people stopped to watch. Michael felt others begin to approach him, and the conversations grew louder. He saw people's looks change. Some said it was beautiful. Some just kept quiet, but everyone began to think. There were some who snorted unhappily and walked away, but Michael didn't notice them anymore. He could see that his words were beginning to resonate. Then an old man, whom Michael had often seen sitting at a bench on the corner, approached the painting. The old man looked at the painting carefully and then said, "You're right. We've let hate decide everything for so long that we've forgotten what love is. Maybe you're right." The old man's words hurt Michael. He knew that this moment was important. People started discussing the painting among themselves, talking about what was really important, and how long ago they had forgotten that love is stronger than hate. It wasn't just a message in the painting. It was a moment when something started to change. Though Henry didn't come to watch, and though he probably wouldn't understand what it meant again, Michael felt that his message was beginning to work. His drawing became the symbol that people began to pass on to each other, that they began to discuss. It became important to them, as if suddenly, after all these years, they were able to look beyond their fears and preconceptions. By evening, Michael was no longer alone with the painting. It was surrounded by people. Some were taking pictures of it, some were discussing it, and as he looked around, he realized that there was something new in these people, a spark of hope. It wasn't the end, it was a beginning that Michael couldn't stop. He believed that love was indeed stronger than hate, and now, with each new person who approached his drawing, he could feel that faith growing. The next day, when Michael woke up, his room was already filled with light streaming in through the windows. He stood up, stretched, and looked at his drawing, which still hung on the wall. The night didn't seem to have made him tired. On the contrary, he felt a surge of energy. Yesterday had been an important day. His message of love and hate seemed to have really started to shift something in people. But his story didn't end there. As he walked down the street the next morning, Michael noticed that people were looking at him differently. He was used to the attention, but today was different. Suddenly a young woman appeared from around the corner with a newspaper in her hands. She approached him, not hiding her smile. "Are you Michael?" she asked, turning the page of the newspaper. "Your drawing is on the front page." Michael frowned. He didn't know what she was talking about. But then he saw that she was holding the latest issue of the local newspaper, with a picture of him at the top of it that read, "Love is stronger than hate." He just stood there staring at the paper, and his heart began to pound frantically. Everything that was happening seemed unbelievable. "Is it true?" he asked, not believing his ears. The woman nodded and handed him the paper. On the front page was indeed his drawing, a vivid, powerful image of Henry with a face full of thought and doubt, and at the bottom, as intended, the words, "Love is stronger than hate." Directly below the image was a brief text describing what was happening in town related to the artwork. The newspaper wrote about how the drawing sparked a wave of public discussion. Michael felt both joy and anxiety at the same time. He suddenly realized that his work had become more than art, it had become a symbol of change. But with that came responsibility. He couldn't just hide in the shadows and keep painting for himself. The whole city saw his message. Word spread quickly, and soon discussions of the drawing became a central topic of conversation in Elmwood. People argued, some supporting and others criticizing. But what was important was that the drawing became something everyone was talking about, and it was certainly a step toward change. Society was divided. As one might expect, there were those who saw the drawing as an act of courage, as a way of confronting what had remained hidden for years under the weight of established prejudice and racism. People spoke of Michael as a hero, who had the courage to take to the streets with a message of love in such a cruel and unjust world. They were proud of his determination and openness. But there were also those who were outraged. They felt that such remarks in the public sphere could harm the tranquility of the town. Some of the older residents said it was not what was needed to fix the problems. They didn't see how a simple message of love could change anything in their world, which they had long considered stable. For the black residents of Elmwood, this drawing became something much more important. It was not just a work of art, it was an act of solidarity and support. To them, the words meant so much more. It was a reminder that despite their trials, they were not alone. It was a message that their dignity and right to respect could not be taken away. On the street, where Michael met a group of his acquaintances from the black community, he was surrounded with smiles and appreciation. Women who had never spoken so frankly to him before now reached out to praise him. "You did it, kid," one of the men said, shaking his hand. "This is a real step forward for all of us." Michael felt his chest fill with pride. He was part of something much bigger. He wasn't just a boy drawing pictures, he had become a voice that needed to be heard. When he got home, the paper was still in his hands. His Saturday at the table, looking at his painting, and felt his heart quieten. It was the first moment he could tell himself that maybe he really could make a difference in this world. But at the same time, Michael also felt the weight of responsibility. This message, this word love that he had put into his work, was not just pretty words. It was a challenge to himself. He had to keep going, despite all the negativity and difficulties that his public statement might bring. At that moment, his mother entered the room, looking at him with a smile. She, too, already knew about the newspaper. She came silently to him, sat her down beside him, and said quietly, "I'm proud of you, Michael. You did what I always knew you could do. You're standing up for what you believe in, and that's the most important thing." Michael looked at her and felt pride fill his chest. He knew that his job now was not just to paint. He was the one who could show the whole town that even in the darkest corners, light could be found if there was faith in love. "Thanks, Mom," he said with a smile, thinking that his journey was just beginning. That evening was an unusual one for Henry. He was sitting in his old armchair by the window, looking thoughtfully out at the street, when there was a knock on his door. Henry didn't usually expect visitors, much less the kind he'd like to see, but this time his face changed slightly when he heard the knock. He got up from his chair, walked to the door, and opened it without hesitation. Standing there was one of the local guys, not too familiar to Henry, but with a sort of nervous expression on his face. The guy was holding a newspaper. "Hey, Henry," he said, handing him a fresh issue. "Did you see this? This is your town. This is your street. The drawing of this boy, Michael." It became the highlight of the day. Henry accepted the paper perplexed, not immediately realizing what he was supposed to see. When he unfolded it, his gaze fell immediately on a large photograph, a drawing of Michael. Henry instinctively clenched the paper in his hands. He stared at the picture of himself, depicted as an old man, withdrawn, with a face full of unspoken fear and regret. Underneath the picture were the words, "Love is stronger than hate." At first Henry could not understand what it was that moved him so. He was shocked at his face, his expression. His life had become the object of someone else's gaze. He could have just ignored it, like so many other things in his life, but something was wrong. He felt his heart clench, and his gaze frenzy on the words beneath the picture. Love is stronger than hate. Why did those words echo so insistently in his mind? Why did they disturb him more than he was willing to admit? Henry looked at the drawing again. He saw that Michael had depicted him not just as a stone-faced man, but as a man whose eyes were closed and hurt. The picture was like a mirror reflecting all his mistakes, all the hatred and hostility he had carried within him for years. The picture was more accurate and ruthless than Henry himself could have imagined. He was depressed. Those words, that picture, would not leave him. Henry had always lived in the belief that his hatred of black people was justified. He believed that their very nature could be questioned, that they had always been and would always be less than him. He had hidden his anger and insecurity behind a mask of superiority for so long that now, looking at this drawing, he suddenly realized how hard it was for him. Love is stronger than hate. The thought wouldn't leave his mind, and Henry felt the weight of it. He wondered what he had been thinking when he first began to feel contempt and aggression toward people who were like him but of a different skin color. When he was young, he could explain his attitude toward black people by pride in his nation, by a belief in their inferiority. But now that he saw the message, he wasn't so sure. What if he was wrong? What if all this time he had been playing on his hatred, not realizing that deep down, he himself was a weak man who didn't know how to be open to others? Henry suddenly felt regret. It was painful, but important. He felt the hatred and anger he'd lived with for so many years become redundant. It was as if those feelings no longer made sense. His mind began to question what he believed to be true, how his past had affected his relationships with people, and how self-attached he was to those hateful, demeaning beliefs. Henry remembered his behavior with Michael, with this boy who was genuinely trying to be himself. His cruel words, his attempts to humiliate him, to tear up the drawings. Now that he saw that message in the painting, he felt ashamed. Michael was just drawing, and Henry was ruining his dreams, thinking that by doing so he was standing up for something important. But what now? Where was his pride? A light appeared in Henry's eyes, but it was grim and uncertain. He never thought that this drawing could have affected his perception of life so much. He looked at the paper in his hands and suddenly realized that he needed more than an admission of error. He needed to face himself, to look in the mirror and see everything he had been hiding from himself. He didn't know how to begin this journey, how to possibly change himself, but he knew one thing: if he continued to ignore these doubts, his life would never change. He put the paper down on the table and, after another glance at Michael's painting, turned it toward the window. At first it might have been out of mere curiosity, but now Henry felt that perhaps he was witnessing something much bigger, and his own mistakes, his own hatred that had long been a part of his life, no longer seemed so certain to him. Henry went to the window and looked outside. At that moment something changed in his soul. He didn't know what to make of this feeling of regret, but he knew it wouldn't be empty. Maybe I really was wrong, he said quietly to himself, as if trying to make sense of these emotions. Maybe I could have been different. As the weeks passed, the traces that Michael's drawing left behind were still visible in Elmwood. What had once been a simple act of protest and a boy's personal struggle to be heard was now part of the city's culture. The streets were still discussing this unusual move, but now, instead of anger, there was something else in those discussions, something important that was changing the very atmosphere of the city. Michael often walked around the city, now no longer so shy of the stares of passers-by. He couldn't help but notice how his message of love became part of conversations, how people obsessed with their daily routine were now laughing and talking about the possibility of change. The drawing became the symbol that everyone wanted to take as a sign that anything was possible. It was possible to change hearts. It was possible to fight hatred and prejudice. One of the most noticeable changes was that shortly after the drawing, a new project appeared in the town square. The old, abandoned building that Henry had once considered part of his territory for so long was replaced by an exhibition of work by local artists. It was a place where everyone could now express their thoughts and feelings through art. At the opening of the exhibition, Michael stood with a nervous smile, clutching his painting in his hands. He looked around and saw people of all ages and backgrounds looking at his work with interest. Some approached to learn his name, others to talk about the message he conveyed through his art. Michael was proud. He felt that at last his labors and dreams were beginning to be heard. His message, his belief that love can conquer hate, had become central not only in his life, but in the lives of many of the people of Elmwood. He saw the views of people who once looked at him as just a boy now change. He felt his dreams of a better future becoming a reality. The passers-by who had previously avoided him were now meeting his eyes. Old men, with whom Michael had been hesitant to even speak, now smiled at him and offered him their hand. But the most important thing was that he no longer felt threatened. There was no hatred, no contempt. Everything had changed. Yet the most important moment for Michael was when his drawing did something he could not have imagined. It opened the way for others who were also hiding their dreams and their talents. With each new person who discovered the meaning of his drawing, Michael felt a light come on in the city. Henry, a few days after seeing the painting, also began to notice changes. He did not immediately recognize that something had really changed, but his life began to change. He began to look at people more often, meeting them without prejudice. Although he still felt he had a long way to go, he couldn't help but notice that his attitude towards those around him was becoming different. He realized that it wasn't just a picture with an inscription, it was his personal encounter with his own reflection that finally forced him to reflect. And so, on the day the exhibition opened, Henry, in the very corner of town where his store used to be, approached Michael's painting, which now hung among the other works. His gaze stopped on the words the boy had written beneath the image, "Love is stronger than hate." A new spark appeared in Henry's eyes. He walked over to Michael and held out his hand. "I was wrong," Henry said, holding back his emotions. "You showed me that there was another way. You're right, love really is stronger than hate. Thank you." Michael looked at him in surprise. He still remembered the moment when Henry had torn up his drawings, when his anger and aggression had seemed overwhelming. But it was different now. It wasn't just an apology. It was an act of realization Henry had given himself. Michael, with a genuine smile, shook his hand. He knew it was more than a gesture. It was a moment of reconciliation, a moment of change. "We can all change, Henry," Michael said, feeling his heart filled with light. "The important thing is not to be afraid of it." On this day, as the city took on a new meaning, Michael realized that despite everything that was happening, despite all the moments of pain and frustration, he was more than just an artist. He was a witness to change. He knew that the message of love he had once painted for himself was now something that had changed an entire city, and that was just the beginning. Because love really is stronger than hate, and nothing can stop the light when it comes. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.